Welcome everybody to Dorset Humanists and to a recording of another one of Dorset Humanists online talk events. I should explain that due to a small technical hitch, we are missing the first few minutes of this talk, and so I'm putting in an additional introduction. After the introduction, I'll put in the first few of the speaker's slides as well, because we missed them in the recording. So the speaker for this talk is Henri Ruff, and his subject is COVID-19, is it a game changer for the economy? A large part of what Henri refers to as his checkered career has been spent in financial services, including third world debt negotiations, mergers and acquisitions finance, as lobbyist, and culminating in being an economic advisor at Visa, the electronic payments provider. His career in international banking is involved in working in the City of London and other fine cities such as Paris and Washington, DC. But for the last 15 years, before retiring full-time, Henri has worked for the Open University Business School as a tutor, a trainer of tutors, and writing course materials. Since moving to Dorset, Henri has been leading a weekly U3A discussion group on everyday economics. Topics range from very serious subjects, such as why economists are hopeless at forecasting, to light-hearted ones such as the economics of dating. Today, he's going to help us consider whether and how the current coronavirus crisis may turn out to be a game changer for the economy. Okay, here are Henri's first couple of slides, and then we'll move straight on with Henri giving his talk. We did play these first couple of verses of the Bob Dylan song, but we can't put them on the YouTube anyway because of copyright issues. Henri said he particularly took the message in the second verse there as a starting point for his talk. These are the conditions that require an opinion for something to be an actual game changer.
Behave differently. That's a push factor. A pull factor relates to the newly found benefits, the attractions that, if they are enjoyed, might have a much more lasting effect. Couple of brief examples to illustrate, well, push factor and a pull factor. I think they're good examples because they're actually real and they're current. We've got some friends. They are very, very keen on their garden, very keen indeed, but not at all keen on gardening. No, their passion is sport. He plays golf, she plays tennis. They both enjoy sailing, and they, of course, enjoy socializing a great deal in the summer months, barbecues and drinks in their garden, which they enjoy, but they don't enjoy gardening. Well, in the last month or so, due to the lockdown, due to also the need to keep active, they've been really busy the whole month long, gardening. Unbelievable. I don't know what's going to happen after the crisis is all over, but I suspect that they've been pushed into this frenzy of gardening, and once the pressures are off, they'll revert to their more usual passions. Example of a pull factor, well, just recently some new neighbours have moved in, a young family with 3 young children, and of course with a lockdown and the children of course not being able to go to school, husband there, he's working from home, and the wife, I understand she's been furloughed, so she's at home, and I get the impression that they're enjoying family life like never before. The children love it. They all go out as a family cycling or walking, enjoying this fresh air, far less polluted, and so on. And that may well be a pull factor that has a lasting effect. He's going to go back to work as soon as he can, but perhaps part of his work, he'll be able to negotiate to spend much more time at home on the desk element of his work. Not sure what she's going to do. Hopefully her job does survive. She'll go back, but she might want to negotiate a 3-day week or 4-day week so that she can get home, see the children who come back from school, unfrazzled by the office politics that she's used to when she's stuck in the office. So a couple of examples of the push and the pull factors, I think useful because push factors give us a clue that it might not have a lasting effect. Pull factors give us a clue that in fact it may well have a lasting effect. The other problem with game changers and trying to identify them is that, well, they can differ, and they can differ according to which economy you're looking for them in. It may be the UK that you're focused on, or just a region within the national economy. But some of you may be interested in game changers further afield, perhaps in developing countries rather than developed countries, perhaps in a large economy rather than medium or smaller economies, perhaps in the so-called real physical economy or the digital economy. So in my talk, I'm not at all specific about which economy I'm talking about. We're looking for game changers wherever they might appear. So where to look? I've looked in 3 areas where I think there may be possibilities of game changer. The first is the underlying aim of an economy. The second is the principles or rules by which the economy is governed. And thirdly, the likely winners and losers. And so I'd like to look in those 3 areas in turn to see if we can spot some game changers. Let's take a look at changing the aim of the economy. Traditional economic theories and actually economic reality place enormous importance on efficiency. And when economists talk about efficiency, what we're talking about is getting the most out of the resources available. Limited resources, maybe extensive resources, but getting the most out of them. Examples of these, and I'm sure you've come across them, read about them, maybe even experienced them: lean production, just-in-time methods of delivery, and all this efficiency measured in just one metric, and that's profit, the measure of efficiency. But the crisis has started many of us to rethink, well, what should the aim of the economy be? And perhaps it should be to become an effective economy rather than merely an efficient economy. To be effective is doing the right thing, rather than efficiency, which is doing things right. Experience in the crisis already, or I should say so far, calls into question whether an economy hell-bent on efficiency takes suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk. These are risks like outsourcing production overseas, which we've seen, over-reliance on a seemingly perfectly integrated supply chain, which we've seen coming apart in places, and the risk of measuring efficiency only in terms of what can be quantifiable financially, that's to say in money terms. Now contrast that with an effective economy, which captures not only the known and anticipated risks, as it do in the efficient economy, but also using scenario analysis, or so-called what-if analysis, and identifying unknown risks, sometimes called black swans. These are the risks of having an extreme impact of a rare and unpredictable so-called outlying events, and risks that are not easily quantifiable in money terms. For example, the value of life. So an economy that moves towards being an effective economy rather than merely an efficient one, the focus then moves towards becoming a resilient economy, a robust economy that can withstand the shocks. And the measure of a robust economy is not the strength, or the measure of robustness is not the size of GDP or the rate of growth, which is what efficient economies are obsessed with. Instead of that, the measure is stress testing, just as we've seen after the financial crisis 2008 and beyond with the banking industry, where at least the major banks have been stress tested. And so what we're talking about maybe is a game changer that moves from a fragile economy to an agile economy. Let's see if we can find any game changers in that second area, which I mentioned just a moment ago. That's to say the principles or the rules by which an economy is governed, and often the rules are then transformed into actual regulation. Every economy is governed by economic principles, and I should say that the mother of all economic principles is division of labour, specialisation, because of the advantages in terms of improved productivity specialisation affords. And of course, once specialisation, division of labour crosses boundaries, national boundaries, that becomes international trade. And from international trade, there's globalisation. Now, the modern mantra of globalisation has been institutionalised in our way of life by organizations such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., 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 and a host of supranational groups such as NAFTA, the EU, and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But their influence, the influence of these institutions and the principle, is being challenged. And in fact, the raison d'etre of some of these institutions are being challenged. What we've already seen, is rule breaking by members of the World Trade Organization. They belong to the WTO. Some of them, big players like China, have relatively recently joined the WTO, and they're breaking the rules. That's not something very new. But there's something else that's developing, and this could be a real game changer, and that's tearing up the rule book entirely. As a result of the crisis, due, I suppose, very largely to supply chain issues, that's the breakdown of supplies, globally speaking, and a perception that there's an over-dependency on sole suppliers, whether that's one country like China or one company that's a sole supplier. These concerns have actually fueled the sentiment of protectionism. And that sentiment, of course, amplifies what has been an existing chorus of those who've actually been disadvantaged by globalization for some considerable time. The protectionist lobbies have taken the fight to the multilateral organizations such as the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on and so forth, undermining their authority and seeking to tear up the rule book. This 180-degree turn towards protectionism appears to be a game changer. Now, economic history, even of the 20th century, tells us that when the going gets tough in a globalized world, the tough get going by reverting to protectionism. So I'd like to borrow a famous phrase from Orwell's Animal Farm, change it slightly. Globalization good, protectionism bad, changes to globalization bad, protectionism good. But there may be a more subtle game changer appearing than just that. And the mantra may become some globalization bad and some protectionism good. Winners and losers. I think you've heard a lot about winners and losers recently, read about them, and so on and so forth. But I think there's a trap here. And the trap here is to extrapolate, using trend analysis, to extrapolate statistically from the most recent trends and jumping to conclusions very quickly. When you do that sort of thing, winners look like, well, the climate. Online businesses such as retailers and online entertainment. Essential goods providers, won't mention any names there. Online healthcare and aged care providers too. Amongst the losers, well, live entertainment, some higher education, household finances, oil, the oil industry, live sport, tourism and travel. But to avoid this trap, I think it's much more useful to have a look at some of the fundamentals to help us identify some true winners and losers and the game changers at work here. And I'd like to have a look firstly, in this respect, at government involvement in the management of the economy. Now, the game changer here is not whether we continue to move to what's called small government, which is ideological, it's political, as opposed to big government, which again is ideological, political, and to move away from that to something rather different, and that's essential government. A second fundamental, which I think is worth exploring here when we're looking for game changers, is economic recovery itself. If you like, economic recovery means a recovery in consumption. That's what we're talking about. Because Modern economies, whether they're large, mature, or small and developing, they are demand driven. So when we're talking about economic recovery, I guess we've got to look to the demand side, matched, of course, by supply, which hopefully does recover. Supply chains do recover, but we've got to look at the demand side. And economists are quite fond of distinguishing between two types of demand. One I'd like to call consumption, which is non-discretionary. These are the needs. And if you're in any doubt about what non-discretionary demand looks like, you've only got to cast your mind back weeks rather than months to what was flying off the shelves in supermarkets as essential items for living. So that contrasts in economist speak with what I want to call consumerism. That's discretionary wants. So we're talking about demand, we're talking about needs, and we're contrasting them with wants. So where should we be looking for a resurgence in demand? Where should we be looking for the stimulus for economic recovery as far as demand is concerned? And I think we can look at income inequality and a move towards greater equality, because that will stimulate consumption, non-discretionary needs. That will stimulate that. And the big game changer here is that income inequality becomes a requirement for economic recovery and not simply a moral issue of unfairness. I want to wrap things up quite quickly so that we can move on to the Q&A session. But before we do, can I say a few words about the third area where game changers might be found? And that's in the area of economic geography. Despite already living in a world with fewer economic borders, that's thanks to the internet, thanks to digitalization, thanks to remote automation, despite all that, we appear to be on the cusp of living in a world in which political borders are being resurrected. And if that continues, it strikes me that geography is going to still matter. In fact, perhaps more so than ever before. And as Professor Ian Golding at Oxford has argued and has written about, the recovery for advanced economies, mature economies, is likely to be much, much easier than that for developing or emerging economies. And that's another area where game changers may be at play. I'd like to wrap up there, and it's over to you with Q&A.
Thank you very much, Henry. A lot of things to think about there. I'd like people to indicate when, well, first of all, let's indicate our appreciation to Henry for starting us off with today's discussion. Very good. Nice, a lot of nice silent clapping going on. Can I ask you to use the raise hand function to tell me if you'd like to ask Henry a question? Not the clapping hand, but the raise hand in the participants list. And then I can pick out people who've raised it and unmute them. I think Aaron's got a question right away, so let me unmute him. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron, please.
Henry, thank you very much. Yeah, I was just thinking on that very last point, actually, about the geography, and that the EU has come unravelled because all their borders have gone round. And when you want to contain an area and close off your border and contain the virus, when you have an open border, you can't really do that. And I was just doodling a ship diagram there and thinking of the watertight bulkheads that you want to cut off their various areas if you get a flood. The same kind of applies in a massive area when you have a virus. And that the UK should be able to better manage that because we're an island than the other area, which should protect our economy if we do it right.
The question is?
That the UK is better to stand and to fend this off because we're not part of the EU, as opposed to the EU's nation, because they've taken their borders down. They can't equally isolate their area in order to maintain their security.
Well, my take on border situations in what I call continental Europe, right? So we're talking about, if you like, mainland EU, is that actually the barriers have gone up, that the EU has not been unraveled, because in the sphere of health, discretion within the EU is paramount. And what you see actually is pretty effective border controls over there, very early indeed. I won't comment on the situation in the UK because I'm steering away from the politics.
Okay.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to go to Jack now, as Jack had his hand raised. Just a moment. Slightly incompetent at this.
Your comment about income inequality, please.
Sorry, I didn't catch it. Could you repeat it?
Could you just explain to me a little more about your statement about income inequality?
Right. Yes, yes. Now I've understood the question now. I didn't hear it first time round. So as regards income inequality, and I mentioned very early on that I wasn't being economy specific, but in a number of economies, both large and medium and small, there's a great deal of income inequality. And in economies where that is the case, what you've got is consumption, that's to say, essential consumption has long been the poor cousin of consumerism. So if you want to stimulate demand, the area that you want to concentrate on is basically consumption as opposed to consumerism. Now, you're not going to be able to stimulate that kind of demand without addressing the basic issue of inequality of income. And can I just emphasize, I'm referring to inequality of income as opposed to inequality of wealth. I see the two as being very distinct. And as terms of managing that change, I would say trying to improve on income equality is going to be a slightly easier task for policymakers than wealth inequality. So that's a management issue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Now we've got two Barrys in the list who would like to speak. I'm going to go first of all to Barry King. Barry, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Henry, I know you want to stay clear of politics, and you've made that very clear. And it may be at the moment the very demands of the situation that we have are driving the policy responses of the government. And I mean, what our government has done has been almost unthinkable in the amount that it's committed to resurrecting the economy. But many people would argue that there is, within certain governments, and perhaps ours, an ideological commitment to a certain sort of economic system, which may well be reinstated if that ideology does not change after the resurrection has taken place. It needs a fantastic change in mindset by certain groups within the political polity that we have. And thus, I think it will depend very much upon the sort of framework that governments have to move forward. And I just wondered what you would say to that, because there are some automatic forces at work, but ultimately government must fix the market system.
Right, Barry. Well, you did warn me when you joined the meeting that you were going to give me grief. So I'm not surprised you're giving me grief now. The reason I like to separate out the economics from the politics, and of course I accept they're virtually inseparable, right? Mainly because of the point you last made, economic policy is actually determined and then carried out by the politicians. So of course I accept that. The reason I want to focus on the economics is that in a way, public attention and public focus is so largely on the politics and overlooking the actual economics. So I just want to lay the ground there before I go down that road. But the other thing, but to move on from that point, what I would say is that when I'm talking about a game changer for the actual aim of the economy or the underlying foundations of the economy, I'm not talking about, you know, the destruction of a capitalist system at all. On the contrary, an effective economy basically breathes life back into the capitalist so-called free market economy. It doesn't spell the death knell at all.
And I didn't really mean that it would be the end of capitalism, but one may say that capitalism has had the most fantastic raising of living standards and welfare after over 250 years. But there are certain forms of it in the modern world which are relatively dysfunctional in terms of the rewards that various groups of people in society get. And thus we may have another economic model within a healthy capitalism.
Yes, and the argument I proposed, if you like, or outlined, if you like, the game changer is to move from a merely efficient one to an effective one.
Yes.
Can I just add a comment to what you said there? Regardless of the enormous rewards that capitalism or the so-called free market mechanism has bestowed on, well, some, maybe many in some cases, regardless of that, there are fundamental limitations, you could argue fundamental flaws in the market mechanism. And amongst those who wish the market mechanism well, it's a question of addressing those limitations and flaws. And that's where this is an opportunity for a game changer.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barry. We're having a small problem with the blue hand system, and I'm just going to unmute David Warden as the chairman there to let him ask a question before I carry on with the list. So, David?
Yeah, okay, thanks very much, Phil. Yeah, I don't know why I couldn't raise my blue hand there, but never mind. Yeah, thanks very much, Henry. I was really interested in some of the key points you made, which sort of were tantalizing slogans in a way, moving from an efficient system to an efficient economy to an effective one. I mean, I like that juxtaposition. And you also made a distinction between small government, which you said was ideological, big government which equally ideological, and you were suggesting that what we need is a central government. So, you know, I liked those points, but they were kind of quite tantalizing. It would be nice to hear more about that. You also said that some protectionism that you think might be good. But leaving those kind of points aside, I mean, one of the big questions in my mind, and maybe in many people's minds, is the question of how this is all being paid for. I mean, it's astonishing that Rishi Sunak has shaken the foundations of the magic money tree to an absolutely fantastic degree, and must be racking up enormous kind of national debt. And I think it's kind of interesting. It would be interesting really to get your view on where that money's coming from, and are we going to, I think one of the questions that Aaron has raised in some of our recent discussions is, are we going to have a recession for the next 10 or 20 years where we try to pay it all back? So I don't know if you can comment on the debt side of things.
Yes, I'd like to. It's a really important facet of the whole subject matter. Can I just start by picking up on a point you made, and I think you make the point rightly, that most people are astonished by the kind of, it's not just the numbers, right, that Sunak is talking about, but if you like, a volte-face, a 180-degree turn.
Yeah, it's
and
incredible.
I promise to stay out of politics, but for someone whose orientation is his, you might well be astonished. I'm not astonished at all. And one of the reasons I'm not astonished at the stance he's taking is basically that the government it has the ability, it has the competence, it has the power to come up with the money, which comes on to your next point. Where's this money coming from? Well, actually, no real surprises here. It's coming from where it's always come from, even though the numbers might astonish us a little bit. So where does that money come from? One of the most obvious sources, of course, is taxation. And that's a real issue if, in fact, the economy, it's taken a nosedive already, but it plunges maybe further and faster and maybe for longer than hoped for, because tax take is going to be under real pressure. But governments don't bat an eyelid. They can borrow money. And I would argue that government's ability to borrow is virtually limitless. Virtually limitless. The only thing that changes is what I would argue is the price of borrowing, the cost of borrowing. And of course, as governments borrow more and more money, as they look as though they're not just underperforming, but mismanaging the economy, the interest rate rises because people prepared to lend to countries, governments, sorry, national governments, countries, they're taking on more of a risk. So it's just a matter of the price. And the third source, of course, which is hitting the headlines in people's minds is, well, a lot of people talk about printing money. It's not quite as simple as that, but I want to avoid a lot of the jargon. I want to avoid a lot of the technicalities. But basically, there is a money tree. Despite what Theresa May denies, there is a money tree. You can shake it.
We always knew she had a money tree somewhere.
You can shake it if you're a government.
Yeah.
I wish we had one in the garden, but we don't. Have I covered all the points you raised, or have I left uncovered?
Yeah, so would you say that shaking the money tree in the final analysis, money literally just, I mean, for want of a better word, printing money, that's something that could be used in absolute extremis? I mean, I understand Japan is basically doing that now because their debt is so high.
Let's move away from Japan only because you get me talking about Japan, I'm going to start quoting figures, and I'm trying to avoid statistics. Can we move back to this country, much closer to home, and what's called monetary financing?
Yeah.
And monetary financing, I'm sorry for the jargon, but I'm going to explain it in a moment. It came into the headlines because the new governor of the Bank of England at the beginning of a few weeks ago said there's going to be no monetary financing. By Thursday, after a few calls from the Treasury, we're doing monetary financing after all. And the simplest way I can describe monetary financing is a payday loan. The government is borrowing from the Bank of England directly. They are intending to repay because they'll have the money by the end of the month, or is it next month, or is it next year, or at some stage. It's a payday loan, right? And I just want to say one more thing, because with payday loans, I know there can be usurious rates of interest. That's not the case with the Bank of England. So the analogy breaks down there. They're not charging usurious rates of interest. So think about monetary financing as having a rich uncle in the family who looks sympathetically and listens because he's family.
Okay. Thank you, Henry.
Thanks. I've got a question. The next in the list would be Simon. I'm going to unmute Simon. Please go ahead.
Right, thank you very much. It seemed that part of the drift of Henry's excellent talk, the lovely clarity of the way he outlined his issues, that if it's important to get more money in people's pockets so they'll buy essential commodities and start floating the boat again, that seems to be moving us towards something a bit like the universal income, universal basic income that a lot of people have talked about. But can I raise one more thing at the same time, even if it's not quite the same point, because I feel you're likely to come back to that later anyway. Someone's going to ask you about the universal basic income. Can I have mine now? So the other point is, curiously, Andrew and I were rung this afternoon by our financial advisor, who gave us a sort of kind of horrendous 45-minute gabble through world economics. But one of the uncertainties he looked at is the Brexit trade negotiations, and at the end of June, will they decide to go for a hard Brexit, which is another sort of little shipwreck possibly waiting, or will they, be a deferment extension be agreed? And I thought it's very interesting that what the guy said. He said, our impression of this company is that Boris Johnson doesn't want to be seen to be the person asking for that extension. But I thought that, maybe the implication was that every sensible person throughout Europe will be saying, let's give ourselves a bit longer to work this out, even if 6 months or whatever, because of the world economic crisis we're going into. But that it can only happen if Boris's face and Farage's face, everybody's face is saved in some way. Any comments?
Well, 2 comments. I don't think they're going to satisfy you at all. The first one is to say that I am not qualified to give any financial advice whatsoever. So whatever I say, not just in response to your question here or your comment here, but whatever I say, in this talk, please don't go away and act and think, oh, well, Henry said this and that, and, he knows about these things. I am not qualified to offer any financial advice. The other thing I'd say is I'm not very good at it either, even for myself, but that's an aside. The next thing is to say, and this is where I think you won't be very happy with my comment, saving face, all that's politics. I'm sorry, I can't comment.
But can I just say, do you think there sort of should be an extension to these negotiations, and do you think there will be an extension?
I don't forecast, and I tried right at the beginning of the talk to say, you know, if you are a forecaster, you're either brave or foolish. I leave you to decide which that is. I cannot forecast.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Simon. I'm moving on now. Barry Newman had a question. We'll go ahead, Barry. I'm trying to unmute you.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Barry.
Excellent, thank you. Hello, Henry. Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
Can I just take us back to some of the issues you mentioned? You mentioned game-changing being possibly a move from efficiency to effectiveness, from consumption, from consumerism, a swing towards consumption, or perhaps a limitation of consumerism. And you spoke about income equality, and all these things made me think of some utopian dream or revolution. And my question is this: looking at history, and I mean history in the long term, going back many hundreds of years, do you think that this pandemic is massive enough and radical enough to change the paradigm as you have described it? And I'm minded of the flu epidemic at the beginning of the last century, and also the various plagues in Europe that upset social order and changed the structure of society and economics as well during the medieval period. And my question is loaded, really, because I don't see this pandemic as remotely big enough a shock to change the foundations of the system. So my question really is, do you?
Yes, that's a loaded question, as you said. It's a loaded question. My loaded answer to that is
Yes.
no, because I take all the points on board that you just mentioned. But my answer to that one is that, of course, I don't know whether this crisis is going to lead to any or all those game changers or some other game changers. I don't know. However, I do have an inkling that there will be some people in some places that realize it creates the opportunity for game changers and run with that. If they don't realize that, then there won't be game changers. But we're talking about leadership now. We're talking about leadership with visions. And of course, who are we talking about? I'm not going to name names. Where are they? I'm not going to locate them geographically and so forth. You did mention the medieval period, and my reading of the Black Plague is that one of the game changers nestling very deeply in there resulted in the end of feudalism.
Yeah.
But it took an age. But in fact, it was the economic forces at work, shortage of labor, a certain sense of independence within the labor force. Hey, you know, we haven't got the upper hand, but we've got a stronger hand than we had with the Lord of the Manor. And so I see the crisis as possibly creating the opportunities for game changers, but those opportunities have to be grabbed and then run with.
Can I come back briefly?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much for the answer. I don't think the changes are as big as was experienced in medieval times, and therefore I'm not confident that there will be very, very major changes. But I think there will be minor changes, and they may well be dystopian rather than utopian, in that a fragmented world will be susceptible to the acts of aggressive players. And the lack of coordination and the rise of nationalism may in fact weaken global unity. So as well as presenting some very utopian and positive game-changing scenarios, I would rather sadly have to introduce some rather negative ones, which in my darker moments I think are probably more likely. Do you think that's reasonable?
Well, it's reasonable because you set out your reasoning. But you are talking about, if I've understood you correctly, you are talking about politics there, the political situation, because as an economist, if you like, the defragmentation isn't necessarily dystopian or a bad move or a regressive move. In much the same way as globalization, it's not all good. Hence the point I was making earlier. I'm looking at it, if you like, very narrow point of view, just the economics of it.
So not good, not bad, just different.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And when it's different, then it's up to people, you and me, not just, the leadership and so on, you and me to take the opportunity, because differences are the open door for opportunity and change. For the better or for the worse.
Yes, sadly.
Okay, thank you, Barry. I'm going to get Michael next. Michael Ashfield, unmute. Please go ahead, Michael.
Okay, I just want to disagree with one thing that Henri was suggesting, which is that developing economies would recover slower than, for example, places like Britain. If you take an example of a place like India, their export sector is much smaller, their tourism sector is much smaller, their financial sector is much smaller. They therefore have a much greater proportion from straightforward consumption. They also have a very low tax take, so they could in fact raise a hell of a lot more money rather quickly and without imposing upon people very much by just widening the tax base. So is it really the case that developing economies would recover more slowly? That's my question.
Thank you, Mike. Just to put your question into the context, proper context for everyone's benefit, Mike and I are friends and go back a very, very long way. And a large part of our friendship is based on the fact that Mike and I disagree on just about everything. So I'm not surprised that you're disagreeing with me on this point. But you're not disagreeing with me personally, you're disagreeing with, a lot of the work by Ian Goldin at Oxford. I've lent heavily on him, so I'm not abdicating responsibility for what I said. My understanding of his more general argument is that developing, if you like, emergent economies are more vulnerable, and it is, generally speaking, one of the reasons for that is, if you like, in recovery mode, you tend to need to borrow, and their credit rating, if you like, their access to the financial markets and the cost of access is maybe that much greater for the economy than, say, a developed, a very mature and a large economy. So that's one of his arguments about why developing might have a difficult time of it. His second, I'm not going to go through all 23 of his arguments, by the way, but his second argument is that in the wake of the crisis, big questions and marks around supply chain and trying to stay away from the politics now, supply chain issues and the the move towards protectionism, in the sense that people think, well, we should be producing some of these things in our own country, in our own economy. And developing countries, emerging countries rely so much on their growth and their development trade. So they might have less access for their goods and services. In the case of India, it's services as well. Talk about tourism and other things. So those are just two of the planks on which he builds up his argument.
I better do my homework in that case and find out what he was saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just going to unmute John Kingston now. John has a question.
Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
thank you. Hello?
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we
Hello.
can.
Yes, Henry. One of the things you keep saying is that you wanted to separate economics from politics, but at the same time, I think you accepted that it was impossible to do so. And I was just going to emphasize the fact that it is impossible to do so. And if you're looking at what will happen, how we'll recover after, and you know, what will happen to society after the COVID crisis, it's absolutely fundamental, is it not, to think, well, are we going to have a George Osborne approach, for example, to say, well, we're in huge debt here, so we've got to tax people, we've got to contract the economy, and therefore take a very large amount of time to recover and hit the poorest very hard, as obviously happened from the 2009 to the present time, really. Or are we going to use government's ability to spend and to effectively expand the amount of money available? But, you know, which is an economy, modern money theory. I don't know if you are a subscriber to that, but however you do it, we have the choice between expanding the economy in a Keynesian type way or contracting it in a George Osborne way, and that is an economic choice.
You're asking for a comment?
Well, the comment is that what I was hoping that you would concede is that if you're looking forward to what will happen, then that is a political as much as an economic question.
Well, I certainly concede that politics and economics are virtually inseparable, but not. I don't accept that it's impossible to separate them out. That's the first point. And that, in fact, I'm trying all the time, and you heard it also in the Q&A, not just in my talk, how I'm trying to keep on the economic track. Mm. The second point I would make is that austerity, if you like, let's not name names like George Osborne, let's just stick to the policies. Austerity is an ideological commitment wrapped up in some, let's just say, selective bits of economic theory. Mm. In the same way that, if you like, well, you talked about, you know, well, the money tree and modern monetary theory and so on, you talked about that. That again is an ideology wrapped up in some economic theory. I'm interested in the economic theory itself, and I'm very interested in the idea that, and you have said, you've put this in so many words, it's an either or. And I say, as an economist, that's binary thinking. And of course, in the political sphere, and dare I say, in the political sphere like Britain, where you've got a government and opposition, the politicians like to encourage us to think in either or options.
Sure.
And I'm arguing that strip out the politics and you achieve a much more eclectic, and I would argue more balanced set of policy proposals and then policies themselves.
Thank you. Can I just say that if I go blank in a minute, it's not a comment on what you're saying. It's a comment on the fact that my battery's running out.
Sorry to hear that.
But thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Now we've got Hugh, but this is Hugh O'Boyle, Gerard's son. I'm just going to unmute you, Hugh. Are you ready to ask your question? Hang on. Oh. There.
Oh, hello everybody. Thanks very much, Henri, for that talk. Very interesting, and also thank you to everybody for having me this evening. I actually had a question about universal basic income. I know you might have talked about it already. It seems that talk about universal basic income and the debates and studies have all increased in the last maybe 10 years as work has become more precarious and unstable, and also the wages are insufficient to meet basic living needs. And we've seen that in the way that 80% of wages has actually pushed a lot of people further towards the poverty line. So I would say that this has exposed the flaws within a free market economy. And also that work-related income, the income you make from work, is no longer reliable or conducive to what you called an agile economy in the 21st century. So my question is UBI, universal basic income, is it now not only desirable to address the flaws in our free market economy, but also more possible thanks to shifting public attitudes as people realize there is a money tree?
Okay, thank you. You were cutting out a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your question. But if I've missed out bits, just come back to me on it. So, universal basic income, and there'll be some of you I know in this session who know a great deal more about it than I do. So, but then there are others who may, yeah, they've heard about it, but not very familiar with it. And unfortunately, we don't have the time in this session to go into it in a great deal of detail. Perhaps another session and so on, it warrants another session. I'd make a couple of comments. The first one is that it actually covers quite a multitude of different forms. And there have been experiments with this in various countries, Finland and elsewhere. I think the most long-standing, if you like, the best developed is in Alaska. And as I understand the Alaskan scheme, it's, when I say unique, it's founded very largely on the fact that they're sitting on an immense amount of wealth, which, natural resources, I should say, natural resource, which is a source of wealth, and that, again, ideologically speaking, some people will argue that resource, that wealth belongs to the people, and therefore universal basic income is justified on those grounds. I would certainly agree with you, that's to say, I share your view that these kind of proposals get an airing and a sharing, and now is the time when they do, and it may well be that it's picked up and run with. This is, if you like, the opportunity for it. If you're asking me for my personal opinion, I don't know if you are, and I'm not sure what value it has, but I suspect that these kind of proposals will have no lasting effect. That's to say that with the recovery, if there's a recovery and when there's a recovery, it'll fade back into the background of people's thinking and policy. That's my take.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Hugh and Henry. Yeah, I think that's a shame personally, but Aaron is coming back again. So I'm going to unmute Aaron and his money tree.
Hi, yes, my question was also going to be on universal basic income. I think you've covered a large chunk of it there, and you don't want to go into specifics, but I'm going to push you for specifics because that's why we're here. I read an article on this from the Green Party back in 2015, and although I'm quite happy to say I'm a Conservative, I think universal basic income is a great scheme, and had we done it at the beginning of this COVID issue, rather than dishing out money for furlough and all this kind of stuff, give everybody the set wage for a period of months, and then everybody is managing, and just freeze all company assets. Is this not a good way forward to get us through either a temporary thing or possibly indefinite? Because it does work out cost neutral in the UK. It pays for itself by eliminating one lot of benefits with another, etc., etc.
And you're asking me what exactly in all that? Sorry, you're asking.
Wouldn't it have been a better idea to do that at the beginning of the crisis rather than for the Chancellor to dish out billions of this, that, and the other in piecemeal? Just give a blanket, fix everybody up with the right money, and now to move forward with that policy.
Well, to answer that question, in the same way that I was leaning on Ian Goldin, Professor Goldin, when I was talking very briefly about, emerging countries and developing countries, I'm going to lean on Guy Standing when it comes to universal basic income, because I regard him as the professor, of course, and this is his thing. And amongst his many arguments is the idea that, oh yes, we can afford it, because actually we are privileging certain segments of the economy hugely with tax breaks and so on. If we rescinded that, we could reallocate that kind of money. That's part of his argument. So he argues that yes, we can afford it, we just have to rearrange our priorities. But if we can afford it in that way, I suspect that in a crisis like the one we are experiencing, universal basic income would take quite a long time to actually implement. And right now, with lockdown, a quick fix is warranted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. So Simon is coming back with another question now as well. Simon, please.
Right. Hello. So going back to the money tree, this thing which any lucky British person has got in their back garden. It's wonderful that we've got this thing, but on a purely economic question, because I'm quite sort of scared of talking to you now in case we stray into the terrible area of politics. So on a purely economic front, if I keep going to the garden and getting more money from my money tree, at what point do I get hit by inflation? At what point does houses, everything else start costing more?
Well, if I can kick off by saying you're right on track now. You're telling me that I've kept you on the economic track, and we're talking economics now. We're not talking politics. And it's a very fair question and a very good question, very fair question. And what I would say is that whether or not shaking the money tree has an inflationary effect depends on whether or not demand actually becomes resurrected. Not only is it stimulated and revived and refreshed and healthy and buoyant, but that it outstrips supply. And I suspect you're looking a long, long way into the future before that is likely to happen. And the reason for saying that I think that's only on the distant horizon, if on the horizon at all, is that the longer, the deeper the crisis, the more difficult is going to be the recovery. When I say difficult, it's going to take a lot longer. Some economists, you can read about them, they got, you know, about the alphabet soup, you know, that lovely soup. I used to enjoy it as a kid, when you had these little pieces of vermicelli shapes of A, B, C, D. So the economists have got this wonderful alphabet of soups. There's the V, that looks like that. Down, we're going down, not sure how far, and then quickly, this is the bounce back effect. And then other economists talk about the U effect. Yeah, we're going down. We're kind of going to drag along the bottom, but then slowly we're going to recover. And there's another, and that's the L-shaped recovery, where we're going down and we're staying down for an awful long time. And so what I'm saying is, I think the prospect of inflation, because you shake the money tree, is a long way away. I must confess, I think the supply chain issues have been exaggerated, grossly exaggerated. I believe supply chain issues are going to be resolved fairly swiftly in the foreseeable future, after there's been a gradual recovery. What I'm saying in the simplest terms, this is what all economists say, it's all down to demand and supply. And I suspect the demand isn't going to be forthcoming very soon.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I'm coming to David Nunn now. David, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Okay, I've tried to word this as precisely as possible. If all economy, because this is a global thing, you know, the virus doesn't respect global boundaries, so it's a global economical issue. If it's hit all economies about the same, or proportionally about the same, they've all borrowed about the same, they've all shaken the money, the magic money tree about the same, they all have about the same amount of depressed economies and supply and demand issues, etc., etc. So they're all on the sort of level playing field. Doesn't it balance everything off? And actually, we can just all say, all together, let's forget all the debt we've all created, because we've all got about the same. We'll all recover together and just crack on as before.
I can't share that view.
It was a question. It's not a view, but I just think if everything's gone down the same, then surely we're all talking about all on the same level.
Well, that's why I don't share that view. I don't think it's all the same. I think what's happening, and a lot of people are saying the same thing as you've just said, I think people are, how can I say, I think they're confusing the fact that the virus can spread, it has spread, and it looks to have spread worldwide. And they're confusing that with the idea that the actual solutions to these, or the responses to this, also has to be worldwide. I don't think that's the case. Policy as I see it has been, is now, and for the foreseeable, policy is determined nationally, country by country, I should say. And the other thing I would say is that it affects different countries very differently. And the other thing is, which is why I don't share the view that somehow we're all in it at about the same level, is that countries' abilities to borrow vary considerably according to their, I would say, their economic strength. So a country like Norway, which tops the league of resilient economies in the world, and there are several organizations that measure resilience, and it doesn't matter which organization you go to, Norway's #1, you can guess who the other ones are likely to be: Scandinavia, Switzerland, Germany, etc., etc. Of course, when they go to the markets to borrow, it's a lot easier, it's a lot cheaper than a more vulnerable country, maybe a small country, certainly a developing country. So I just don't share the view that whilst the pandemic is global, the answers are to be found globally, or that we're all in it for about the same.
Okay, I have read that China may well, in the end, benefit economically from this. That they're not going to be hit. Their economy is not going to be hit quite as bad as, say, the West. So it'll put them higher up. Is that possibly true?
Well, I've been reading the same things as you've been reading, so I'm inclined to agree. But
the thing is, I don't quite know
no, seriously, I'm optimistic about the Chinese economy, its recovery, I should say, and I'm less optimistic about various other countries' prospects for recovery. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Now, the next person on the list to ask a question is Daniel, but I see that he's got his mouth full of dinner at the moment. No, he's all right. He's saying he'll go. Although I was going to read out his comment from the group chat, but I'll let him ask his question. Go ahead, Dan.
My question is about printing money. Would you say that it's the same as a flat tax on all wealth, in that £1 in your bank account is worth very slightly less when new money is printed, only as a percentage of the total amount of pounds out there in the economy?
I'm not sure I caught the first bit, that it's the same as a flat.
Yeah, so let's say they print, let's say there are only £1,000 in the world.
Yeah.
And then they print £500. Your £10 and it used to represent 0.1 of the entire economy, and now it's worth less because there's more pounds out there. But everyone would be affected the same in a way, or if you have more money in the bank, then I guess it would affect you more. So would you say that it's kind of like a tax, but an involuntary one? So you don't, yeah.
Yeah, so I get what you're at, right? And I'd say, the quick answer to that is I don't see it as being the same. But the reason for saying that is because I see the money supply and the whole issue of the money supply as being far more complex than that. And the reason for saying that very briefly is that what is so important is not just the stock of money in an economy, but it's what economists call the velocity of circulation, just how fast it's going around the system, in the same way that blood goes around, our veins and arteries and so on. It's circulating, there's a currency. Or indeed the water going around your central heating system, it's about the same. So I just don't see it as simply as that, because it's a stock, but it's also a flow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Now, nobody has got a raised blue hand at the moment, but there's been a lot of commenting in the group chat. There are a lot of people coming back to UBI, in fact, yeah, and making a number of points about that. Hugh, in fact, as it turns out. I don't know if we want to talk some more about it. I think the gist of the comments is really that the cost of administering the systems that are in place are, because they're so complex, is very high, and something like UBI would be very cheap to administer because it's the same for everybody. It's rather like a very simple tax system takes the costs of administering it out of the equation, really, because it's so simple. So is there any relevance in that, or is the cost of administering a complex benefit system not really relevant when it comes to adjusting the economy?
Well, one of the, again, main arguments, guy standing again, says it all, is this cost of administration. And therefore, you know, I hate to use this phrase, but in more normal times, you could consider that and say, well, in terms of administration, it's less expensive, it's easier to administer, and so on and so forth. So there's a distinct advantage of that. That said, I'm now going to say, but in reality, I think the main obstacle to universal basic income is actually a political one. And I'm not talking about the politicians, but in whatever society you're talking about, it would be an anathema to a lot of people, that you have a scheme like that. It would be an anathema, despite a strong case in its favor. I'm simply saying I'm not holding my breath on that one.
Yeah, I understand. I've just unmuted Hugh O'Boyle again. He didn't raise his hand, but he did make a good point back in the chat, and I wondered if it's worth raising on a separate issue about whether we're dealing correctly with externalities that are not normally valued, such as biodiversity and soil quality and aquifers and things like that. And a lot of people think that's an important thing that needs to be taken account of now, and is often missed out by economists. Do you want to comment on that, Henry?
Yes, I would. First of all, I think this is a really important issue, and that if we moved in that direction, that's to say, developing ways of measuring these are assets, these have value, and they're very difficult to value financially using money for all sorts of reasons. But if you could come up with different systems, metrics to capture the value of that, we'd be far further advanced. And in my view, we'd be moving in the direction of a more effective economy as opposed to a purely efficient one. I personally couldn't agree more. The other thing I'd say in defense of some economists, they've been working their whole careers long on developing these metrics, but who's paying attention to that? The people, the policymakers, are they paying attention to that? But then I'm now, on the cusp of talking politics.
Okay. Well, I think we might have run out of questions in the... I can hardly believe that. I'm sure there are more and more questions that we could... I think we're perhaps just getting a little exhausted. But I really appreciate the talk and the long discussion we've had in answering all the questions, Henry. So I think everybody should show their appreciation again in the normal manner, silently. And I'm tempted to open the muting so that we can have a general chat, but I know that will be a cacophony. So anyway, thank you very much, Henry. We'll all be discussing this for some time, I think.
Well, thanks to all of you for joining me for some good chance to air your questions, raise your questions, air your comments. Thank you so much indeed for inviting me.
Thank you. Talk, Henry. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry.
Thanks, Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.